And with that, I want to welcome Dr. Lina Carpenter as our guest. And would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you'll be talking about today?
Yeah, it's funny because I technically got my PhD last December and I'm still getting used to being a doctor. It takes such a long time to adjust to it. So I got my undergraduate degree actually at UC Santa Cruz in fine art of all things. And then it took me a while to get my master's degree in educational psychology, focusing on early childhood. Um, and then I got a second master's in education, and then my PhD is in education. But a lot of what I've done is actually psychology, which is how I discovered that in PhD programs, it's a very vague degree system sometimes. I would say I have a background heavily in child development. I love working with young kids. My specialties are in empathy and prosocial development, which is helping behaviors, and I'm interested in the motives behind helping, and versus performative kindness versus genuine kindness. And ultimately, in my PhD program, I had a rough time of it in my master's program and undergrad as well. And I just would like to save other people the pain and trouble, if partially just because I don't like seeing people suffer, but also because it's inefficient. It seems dumb to not pass on wisdom and knowledge.
I absolutely respect that. And that kind of segues us nicely into um, can you share a little bit more about your
Oh,
journey?
hold on one
Oh,
second. My earbud literally is dying right now, as I was worried it would. One moment. Let me put on my headphones.
no problem. Backup technology, we have it for reasons.
Okay, that should be working.
Yep, we can hear you just fine. Can you hear
I
me?
can hear you too. Yes.
Okay, so I was just going to say, can you expand a little bit more about your journey as an ADHD scholar and kind of what inspired you to focus on accessibility in academia?
So I think I wasn't really that interested in accessibility until around COVID, partially because it kind of got more into the mainstream. I think COVID also kind of brought everything to the forefront. And I think because everyone was struggling, everyone talks about struggling, but when you're disabled, there's an extra burden. And I think that I really also saw that when the world needed it, when normal people needed those accommodations, we made them happen extremely quickly. We can do that. And afterwards, we just reverted back, at least in a lot of cases. So I think that combination of things really made me think about the inequity of everything. And I think also some of my work in organizing union work, where when we tried to talk about contracts, it really struck me that when we would talk to the university and say, hey, as an educational institution, we should really lead the charge. We should set a good example, maybe go over the bare minimum. And the response was quite literally, we do the bare minimum. And that's excellent. We do the bare minimum. And that I think was really a big catalyst for me of, oh, wow, okay, this is not what it should be. This seems broken, and recognizing that if we don't push for essentially extra, we don't even
Hmm.
meet the bare minimum, because the reality is when they say they meet the bare minimum, that's we can try and enforce the bare minimum. They don't meet it, but we can argue for it. And so that was, I think, a really big catalyst for me.
So, um, I guess, what do you think are some common misconceptions about disabled students and scholars in higher education?
I think a big portion of it is really rooted in the fact that disabled students aren't visible. Even physically disabled students, they can't make it to university settings. And when they do, there are so many barriers that it's hard to stay there. And so not only do we not see, visible disabilities, but then we don't see invisible disabilities. And so for me, I've been very, very fortunate to be in a pretty supportive department and have an incredible advisor. Um, but so often it seems like it's something you're not supposed to acknowledge. And so there are just so many small things that people take for granted that become huge hurdles. And I think that's a really key part of trying to explain why it's so difficult to be a disabled scholar. So, like dumb things like laundry. Laundry is an immense battle for me, and having to explain to a normative person the process I have to go through to make laundry happen is baffling to anyone who is not also what I would call neurospicy. There's also we talk about the ADHD tax where it's, oh, I missed that bill. It's a late fee because we don't provide grace in society a lot of the time. I will buy something twice or thrice because I can't find it. My favorite is when I can be very certain of something that is not correct just because my brain has decided that it's going to latch on to the wrong memory. And also what I found is that I would be punished for planning ahead. My favorite part would be when a professor wouldn't really think about the impact of changing the syllabus. And I mean,
Mm.
as someone who's taught, I completely understand things happen, things change, you adjust, but that there wasn't a whole lot of intentionality behind it or understanding of how disruptive it could be to other students. And so, as someone who's like, okay, in order to keep up with academia, I need to be on top of it and plan ahead. And that suddenly is massively disruptive. And also having to explain that a disruption for me is exponentially more exhausting than it would be for a normal person. And it's all of those invisible things and the lack of visible disabilities, that combination that, yep, Marjorie, yep, I've had that happen to me. I have planned out my entire quarter and been like, yeah, I've got all my due dates lined up, and then I'm screwed. And I'm the one who suffers. And then it makes you look like you're disorganized. And so you get in this vicious cycle of, being like, oh my
Mm.
God, I'm the problem. So yeah, there's a lot of mishmashed issues there, but a lot of it's visibility and just the lack of intentionality and the lack of centering students as people.
I love that you brought up laundry. And it made me think like, yes, that's a struggle in my neurospicy household as well. But also like it's challenging enough for like especially a non-physically disabled student to sometimes access those places where simple tasks are done. And like what if there weren't washers that a person could lift the lid on? Like I'm literally just having an open brain moment for that. So thank you for that analogy. So how would you say these barriers impact not just the academic performance, but also emotional and social well-being?
So I think a really, really big part, and I was kind of touching on it, is that you feel like the problem. And particularly in graduate school, I think even in undergrad, there's the imposter syndrome where we're all like, oh my God, the second they figure out how bad I am at this, they're gonna try and get rid of me. Um, or like, oh, this must have been an accident. Like they let me in because they didn't realize what they were dealing with. And I cannot tell you, for most of my PhD, if not my entire PhD, I consistently was like, they let me in by accident. They didn't know. I got lucky. I slipped through the cracks in the right way. How do I make sure that I'm covering myself so I look like I fit in? And so it's hard enough being disabled when the way I would describe it is I have imposter syndrome about life. Like, oh my God,
Mm,
I can't just hack it. Then you get to academia and you're just sitting there like, wow, wow, I'm bad at this. Um, and then having that kind of, not derogatory, but there's a condescending attitude. And I luckily haven't run into it too much, but I do have a mentee who ran into it, where essentially all of the faculty were like, you don't care about this enough. You're not invested enough. And thankfully they crushed their comps. And they said that that was what brought their confidence back, because up until that point, all the faculty were essentially just like, no, I don't know if you're going to make it. And it's just insult to injury. And just it's another layer of exhaustion as well. So it's compounding. And it also becomes difficult to discuss it with other people because they'll say, well, of course, everyone's suffering with imposter syndrome. And having to explain, like, but on a base level, as a person, I have imposter syndrome because I just am sitting here like, I struggle with these everyday things and other people don't. Added then to I struggle with schoolwork and other people are, but I feel like I'm doing it worse. And so that's a really big emotional load. That's really, really, yes. Also, rejecting sensitivity does not help. And a big misconception about ADHD is that it's about focus. It's a lot better to frame it as regulation, and that's regulation across the board,
Mhm.
which includes cognitive regulation. It includes emotional regulation. It includes some physical regulation.
Yep.
Um, and that it's extremely hard for someone who's not neurospicy or not, you know, close to someone who's neurospicy to recognize like what looks voluntary is, yes, it is. I 100% agree. Hyperfocus can be super useful if you can activate it. Unless you're hyper focusing on the thing you're not supposed to be hyper focusing on, like cleaning your
Yep.
house when you have a final paper due. Um, Not that I know anything about that.
Never done that
uh,
before.
no, it's not like my house is immaculate during finals week, or the opposite where it's complete wreck. But it's that lack of visibility and just feeling like you're insufficient and that compounding the emotional load.
What are some examples of moments when you felt validated or not validated in your academic journey? I know you talked about a mentee who was experiencing that, but you have experienced that yourself, yes?
I've been very lucky because I have heard stories from other departments, which are horrifying. And not even for disabled students, just normal students. I've heard awful, awful stories. Um, I want to start with the positive is that I got hugely lucky with my advisor. He has been an absolute blessing. And there was instance in my fifth year actually, where I told him I was struggling with what I call medication roulette, where I had to start a new medication, figure out if it worked. I also have this wonderful issue where the different generic manufacturers vastly change how I react to the medication, which is really fun to try and get when supply chains change. And so I was explaining to him, and thankfully he's hugely understanding, even though I could tell he's like, what? And he was also utterly shocked to realize I'm like, yeah, I'm starting stimulants. He went, wait a second. You're telling me that you got through your PhD and master's without stimulants. And I went, yeah, I didn't want to deal with the medication issue. Yes, insurance as well. Yeah, that whole fun thing. That was actually a main reason I didn't want to do it because the process of getting ADHD medication is quite literally torture for people with ADHD. And we had a really wonderful, deep conversation. And I want to say 15 minutes after I left his office, I got an email from him with a link. He said, hey, this might be something you're interested in. And it was APA Disability Mentorship Program. And that said so much that after, like right after we had had that discussion, he's like, what can I find for, my student? And I ended up being a mentee of that program. I'm now a mentor in that program. And that made me feel incredibly seen and incredibly cared for. And even though I know there are things he doesn't understand, he's 100% a safe person for me. There's no question. In terms of invalidating, uh, I think I've really had issues with professors pushing back with the best of intentions. I think there was one instance where I was really, really struggling. And this was week 8 of 10 weeks per quarter because we have a bizarre system here in the UCs, which is University of California. I know that's confusing. But I was just not doing well that day. And I checked the syllabus. The professor had not put in an absence policy, which is not good practice, but that's a whole different issue. And I emailed them. I said, hey, I'm really struggling this week. What's the absence policy? And their response, and mind you, this was week 8 and I'd attended every class. I had participated in every class. If anything, I'd over participated. Um, and the response was, oh, but the loss of learning is invaluable. So go ahead and come on, but just keep your camera off because this was during COVID. Um, And so I felt cornered because it was 15 minutes before class. I don't think professors really acknowledge the power difference where I I may be on the older end of PhD students. That doesn't mean I think I can push back. So I logged on. I was having a complete and total meltdown, behind the
Uh-huh.
blank side of the screen, just completely melting down. The irony was that the topic that week was mental health. So I was combination melting down and laughing because it was extremely absurd. And also that I had a classmate who, because I have to say, I'm like, oh, my camera's not working. And bless this other student, but they're like, oh, the camera settings. I'm like, no, I don't want to reveal to everyone that I'm having
Right.
a really hard time right now. And
I just have my
so,
camera off because I'm struggling today. And
yeah,
that's hard to say, especially when you're not in a group that understands it.
exactly. And it's a class of like 30 people, and you're all lovely people, but I don't want you to know that I'm having a panic attack.
Yeah.
And what people don't understand is that that knocked me out for 2 to 3 days.
Mhm.
Um, because my cortisol had spiked. I was exhausted. And then there's also just the emotional reaction of like, wow, as an adult, someone's not noting, like she's participated, she's done all this stuff. She's gotten she sent a message through the disability center that says that this student needs accommodations. And while sure, I don't specifically have, grace labeled as a limitation, um, that that just went straight over their head. And didn't answer the question either. Didn't say what the absence policy was, because had they done that, there would have been an opening to say, okay, cool, I'll take the hit to my grade. There was no opening. And so that was one of the most memorable experiences of my PhD program, where I just recognized the total lack of malice, but the massive harm that that could lead to. Um, yeah, it was really unfortunate.
You've already kind of talked a little bit about this as well, but I want to shift into, we were talking about falling through the cracks and everything, and you've talked about some ways that higher education systems fail to see or support disabled students. Um, First of all, are there others that you have seen, and then what advice would you give to university administrators to prevent some of those things from happening, to prevent students from falling through the cracks?
I think the first and foremost things that departments and administrators should do is that they should consult or hire people with disabilities when considering planning. Uh, because things like, for example, just people parking scooters, in inconvenient places. I know people are in a hurry. I know undergrads are like distracted, but I don't have a physical disability, and I haven't specifically talked to anyone I immediately know with a physical disability who's had a problem with that. I know of stories of people who have, and if nothing else, I know a mom who was trying to push a stroller and being like, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to move the scooter, or even better, like I think they're adorable. The delivery robots, they are adorable. They are hilarious. They take up the entire sidewalk. And these are just things that aren't considered or thought about, or they're taken for granted. And if, disabled students do speak up, which I want to point out is a lot of labor, um, they might get a response, but that's a big maybe. And so why bother? Why bother speaking up? Just deal with it. And then after a point, you say, I can't deal with it, and you drop out. I think there's also the fact that people need to center students in general. I think that's an issue with pedagogy. I think that's also an issue with just how we interact with each other. But I think if we started there, that would be a really good first step of taking people at their word. And I do understand there are people who abuse that. I have run into undergraduates who, if nothing else, it's like, how many grandparents do you have that have passed away this quarter? It's like, wait, you have six? Okay, all right, well, okay. Um, but my stance on it is particularly when you get to college, if that's their choice, that's their choice. If they choose to abuse that system, then rather than being fixated on, oh, I don't want to be taken advantage of, just say that, well, the reason I'm giving grace is for the students who do need it. And if students are trying to take advantage of grace that they don't need, that's on them. And you can maybe mention it in class and maybe say something about like, hey, the reason why I do give grace is for the people who need it. Um, but you can't stop people from abusing the system, but there's no reason to then lock away a system for because of those bad actors and basically harm people who really need it just out of that idea.
I think we've mentioned COVID a couple of times and how that kind of shaped things, but I think that idea of race um, really had a moment during the pandemic in ways that it hadn't in academia before. Um, and you also just now mentioned kind of administrators, but also departments. Um, so, like, do you see kind of different things that each of the layers can do to support those students from um, professor to advisor to faculty, even to like graduate assistant or like writing lab staff?
So I think definitely, like I was mentioning, the campus where we talk about the physical environment. We also talk about, and I hate to impose more workshops on people because I fully understand that there are far too many for all of us. But centering students, centering disabled voices, centering minority voices. But I think from a department standpoint, there is the issue of consistency, and that having served on a steering committee, I recognize that you can't, it would be unfair to faculty to try and be like, you need to fit this mold. Um, but I think it's profoundly unfair to students when the minimums aren't set, when the expectations aren't set, because it's also unfair to faculty to not know, like, oh, wait, I should be doing this.
Hmm. Hmm.
This is what's expected. And so departments really need to notice when students aren't getting what they need by setting, like, not setting expectations, but giving examples of what students should expect. Because I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know
Hmm.
that I should be getting checked in with. Um, I didn't know that there were things that I should have been doing by my second and third year. And had maybe there been a just general, like, here's what it's like in academia. By this time, a lot of people are doing this. And well, oh God, that might make me feel a little bit bad. And I don't want to shame, there are ways to phrase these things. Um, but it would have indicated to me like, wait a second, I'm not getting what I need.
Hmm.
Um, because going back to that imposter syndrome issue of just as a person having imposter syndrome, I'm like, well, of course I'm struggling. Like, of course I'm struggling. Like, of course I'm not doing as well because I'm just not going to do as well. Not recognizing that even for a non-disabled person, I was not getting what I needed. And so departments really need to serve that purpose of giving faculty that baseline and giving students that understanding of where the baseline should be. From faculty, I think it is student centered at the end of the day. That I think is really what it comes back to: centering students, hearing their voices, hearing what they have to say. Um, and I think also, I think Amy's mentioning it is really hard when they don't organize a course well. I think that goes back to the lack of training that we sometimes have, particularly in R1 universities where priority is placed on research.
Hmm.
But I think it's important to not just say these are best practices. It's to explain why these are best practices, and really recognizing like that there are invisible things that make the basic things more difficult, which again comes back to centering students. Um, and I think I mean, I guess this is campus, but providing disability services in addition to disability community, because there are two different aspects of disability. There's identifying as disabled, and there are
Hmm.
the accessibility services that you need as someone who's disabled. And rarely are both addressed, um, but they could be addressed at the department level as well. And it really just is a very isolating experience on multiple levels.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it is so frequently um, we tend to silo accessibility and those endeavors into um, just the digital realm or our courses or your instructional designers or the accessibility team working with faculty, of course. But I think we forget sometimes that those departmental and even university level standardizations or you used the word, and now I've totally forgotten it. Um, Requirements, expectations, when those are set, that those can be incredibly important to students and make the rest of that accessibility process even easier. It's like knowing exactly where to go to get the syllabus in every single course rather than having it be paper in some courses and digital in some, and sometimes hidden in the first module and sometimes on the main page. And like something as simple as standardizing those types of things can make a huge impact. And that's not
And I
just
want to
physical.
add to that actually, because Marjorie made a good point. A lot of instructors aren't educators, and that's actually a huge issue, particularly at R1 universities, because they're hired for their research, not their teaching. I think a bigger issue becomes when there is no teaching requirement whatsoever, no experience required in teaching. And then on top of that, the training that's available, if it's available, is often voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
And the people you need to get the training are probably the least likely to buy in, which is why I think it would be on departments and on administrators to build structures. Like it's if you can plug and play, there's a lot less things to go wrong. Because I also sympathize with faculty. It's like if you don't know what the structures of pedagogy are, what are you
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do? The only reason I feel comfortable with pedagogy is because I've literally gotten more than 100 hours of training. And that's how I recognize when a professor of 20 years has a syllabus, excuse me, that doesn't work for students, that's not well structured. So I think that administrators, there's the double step of not just considering the students or the disabled community, it's considering how to enable others to support those students. And in doing so, I think that's a kind of universal design moment where it makes it better for everyone, makes it a lot less painful for faculty too.
Yes, it does, because that's one less thing they have to try to worry about. Am I doing this right? Um, so I guess what are two areas where you think most educators could improve accessibility?
I mean, I hate to harp on about it, but centering students, centering disabled and minority voices, because across the board we do see minority populations and people of color really talking about like I am screaming at the top of my lungs and I get a pat on the head. Or they might get like a yes, we listen to, and there's no follow through.
Mhm.
So recognizing that not only hearing them, but truly responding to them, because there's two parts of that that are so damaging. Not only is there the first aspect of like, okay, I'm not being heard and I'm not getting what I need, but then there's the breach of trust. And that actually damages the university. That damages faculty. Because there have been instances where faculty did not back up students or did not center students. That faculty member is no longer considered safe. And so in order to gain back the trust of students, they have to do a lot of work in order to do that. And they may not even be able to achieve the level of work that they need to do to regain that. And that builds resentment, that builds pushback, that makes it harder for the faculty member to do their job. And so even if it comes down to framing things as self-serving, which sometimes I think we just have to do in this society, just to be like, it's in your own best interest to do this. Um, really centering student voices and hearing them. Um, for other things that faculty can do, I think would be, I think it goes back to structuring, and that really does have to start at the top of structuring things for faculty, to build courses, to teach, to make things accessible. I think that faculty should then think about doing that for their students. That's why rubrics are so important. That's why intentionality in creating your assignments is so important. And I think a lot of that falls by the wayside, particularly when, faculty are pressured to get that other grant, to, do this other project. And which is why I also like, I empathize with all levels of this. It's not easy for any one level or person to handle this. That's why you need just a lot of support from all levels.
I did see that we had a hand up, I think, from Paige Lauer. Paige, if you're able to unmute yourself, by all means, go ahead and ask if that's okay if we take a question, Lena. Oh,
Oh,
it did. Okay. No, it happens all the time. Completely understand, especially with the new functions on Zoom. If you have that enabled and then all of a sudden you go to fix your hair and you're raising your hand, um, no worries. Just a reminder though that if you do have any questions, even if we're not to the Q&A time, if something pops in your head, put it in the Q&A because we can either stop right then if it makes sense, or we can do it at the end. We've blocked in time for that. But if you're like me, if I don't ask it, I'll forget it.
I
So
wanted
feel
to
free
also
to do
respond
that.
to Marjorie's point because
Yes,
she's
please.
like, or she, I should say, they have been making excellent points in the chat. I fully agree that a lot of people don't even know they have a disability. Or what drives me nuts is that a faculty or a professor will say, well, I don't have a student with a disability, so I don't need to do this. And there's two issues with that. Number one, or more than two. The first issue is recognizing how many hurdles there are to get diagnosed, to get those services. Um, Health insurance rarely covers the diagnosis process, and the process itself can take hours upon hours. And that's after you find someone to do the testing. And that's after insurance is telling you they won't cover it. And then also on top of that, you then have to go to the disability office and wrangle with them. And as someone else pointed out, there might only be 4 people working at disability center. At my particular center, not only were there, they had a decent number of staff, but the turnover rate was super high. And for understandable reason. I mean, it's a really difficult position to be put in to serve students who are really struggling. So that's where universal design comes in, and it kind of goes back to like why these things are self-serving. It's like, yeah, okay, sure, you might not have any students who are disabled, but if you do this, if there are students who are disabled or neurospicy or what have you, um, they get what they need. And it often will help just about everyone else too. It will catch the people who are falling through the cracks, who don't even realize they're falling through the cracks.
I I explained something similar to that to an instructor who really was on board with the idea but just couldn't make that last little connection between like yeah, I'm willing to try to fix these PowerPoints eventually so they can be read by a screen reader, but I don't have anybody using that right now and I'm really busy. And I said, but do you have anyone who might need translation, who maybe their English, if you don't make it to where it can be read by a screen reader, our beautiful tool we have to help with translation can't work either. So just because you don't have a student with an accommodation doesn't mean that there aren't people who could benefit from this. And I don't want it to get swept under the rug. And that was like a light bulb moment for
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
But if you don't have those conversations or the space to have those conversations, then those light bulb moments don't happen. So So I want to be respectful of time, and I have a couple other. I want to get to your personal strategies and tips, but I do
Sure,
want to
sure.
ask, like, what does meaningful action toward accessibility look like in everyday academic settings? Like you've talked about centering your voice, but is there like any other like really firm step? Like if you're not doing this, start tomorrow.
So I think one big thing is to recognize, is your content accessible? And that is extremely difficult. Thankfully, as many issues as I have with AI, it also can be hugely helpful for things like accessibility. And I can try and after all that there are some things I wanted to include as resources, and I think there's a AI shell or a GBT that does help with accessibility, that does help with creating alt text. And those things are incredibly important because people can also have temporary disabilities. I actually had a medication interaction that made my vision blurry to the point where I had to expand things to 300%. And even then, it wouldn't always work because, oh no, if it's a bad scan, well, I'm screwed. And that recognizing that you need to scan the text for what we call OCR to make it readable. Um, because if you cannot access the content, you cannot, you're not in the class and you can't participate. I think the second thing is I think I think acknowledging that when you make everything universal, it benefits everyone. So doing things in class that aren't restricted to, say, a certain, I want to say age group, because that doesn't help though, because as a teacher, I have definitely made references that everyone has looked at me and been confused about. But having to be careful about pop culture references is also for students who are first generation, students who are exchange students, um, really recognizing your assumptions, and not assuming prior knowledge, not assuming that people understand things in a certain way. Um, it's easier said than done. And this is why I really think like it's important to essentially hire and consult with disabled individuals, because there are things I'm not thinking of simply because I don't have to encounter them.
Right. That's also, I think, when you get when you have the ability to bring different people in your departments together to have conversations about like what are we doing and how are we doing it, those different perspectives, those different viewpoints can help catch some of those pieces that I might not think about the references I'm using in class, but my GTA or Professor X who's been here for years might be like, yeah, is everybody going to know that? Or that term you're using is freshman first gen student going to understand what you mean by that? Um,
I had to remind a professor that the students didn't know what a postdoc was. Um, and I piped up, and this was a professor who was extremely responsive to students, but they said, "Oh yes, I did my postdoc here," and I said, "Professor, they might not know what a postdoc is," and they said, "Oh, do students know what a postdoc is?" And we're met by blank stares. And they've been doing that introduction for years. That has been their self introduction to their students. And they just didn't realize or think about the fact that students didn't know what that meant.
Marjorie has put something in the chat, but I want to return to it. Um, Marjorie, would you mind putting that comment also in the Q&A that you just made about the issue of instructors? Um, that way we can return back to them. So before we get to questions, um, what were the most kind of powerful tools or mindsets that helped you survive graduate school?
So this is one that usually makes people laugh, and it makes me chuckle, and it's part of why it helps me. Survive out of spite. And I think a really important part of that is you know know what your rights are, which both as a student, as an employee, but also as someone who's disabled. Because once you know that, you can come in with the attitude of, all right, you can't get rid of me. Even if you let me in by accident, you can't get rid of me. I'm going to be harder to get rid of than my imposter syndrome would tell me. Just I'm gonna do it. So surviving and thriving out of spite. I think finding what feeds your mind is what you're going to school for, but what feeds your soul.
Mhm.
So for me, it was service work, it was mentorship. And without that, it wouldn't have been empowering enough to get through, because if you just focus on your schoolwork, particularly if you're disabled, it's so demoralizing because you're like, oh God, I'm struggling. I suck at this. And it's through your service work that you at least get that part of you fueled to keep going. I think you'll get there when you get there. That's another thing that I've had to do in that kind of not interacting, enacting that self-compassion. And the last bit is that at the end of the day, our brains are fancy blobs of chemicals. And regardless of whether you are or aren't neurospicy, that is simply a matter of fact. But particularly if you are neurospicy, recognizing like, well, the chemicals are not working today. That is not a reflection of who I am as a person. That is the chemicals. And so sometimes you have to manipulate that. And realizing that helped me get through those moments where my brain wasn't cooperating. And being like, all right, not today, maybe tomorrow.
Um, how have you learned to hold yourself accountable with self-compassion?
So I think a really big part of it is learning, and this is one of the first exercises that Kristen Neff, who's very big in self-compassion, um, the first exercise would be, how would you talk to a close friend? Because so often when we're on our own heads, oh my God, that was so stupid. Oh my God, how it could be, oh my God. Oh, how could I be so dumb? Um, and if you thought about sitting with, your other self, would you ever tell a friend that if you actually cared about your friend? Um, and the second part of that being, if you are a true friend, you would not let your friend be like, well, I'm just going to give up now. You'd want your friend to do better. You would want to help your friend grow. And so it's really that two part of like, hey, you know, taking responsibility does not mean berating yourself. It means saying, this is what went wrong. This is what I can do better. And that we are always responsible for our behavior. And so that comes down to, okay, I have a problem where I always run late. Okay, that's not going to be acceptable in the long run. I can't always run late. I can ask for grace every once in a while when things go wrong. But then what do I need to do to get around that? And it sucks because it is going to cost a disproportionate amount of energy. And that's where really the inequity comes into play, where it's like, okay, in order to compensate, I have to do a lot more work. Um, but that while you do that, also being gentle with yourself and recognizing like, this is hard to do, but this is what I need to do. Yeah, 11 minutes fast, Amy. Yeah, mine is always set to like 3 minutes fast. That those little tricks to get yourself to enact the behaviors that you need to enact, even if your body and your brain make it more difficult for you.
So, kind of to close and get to questions, like what message do you hope disabled students and educators walk away with? Like if it's after they, whenever you have a chance to tell your story to these individuals, what do you hope they walk away with after hearing that story?
The biggest thing, and this applies to anyone in higher education, I mean, even undergrad would count as higher education. Academic reality is not normal reality. Um, it is a different level of reality. It is not, we talk about the ivory tower. It's it's so much more beyond that. It's maybe parallel to reality, but it's very removed. So trying to explain to people like I cannot afford to take a 2-year position across the country when it takes me 6 months to get my care system into place. But academia will tell you, oh, you're privileged for doing that. And it's really difficult to get past that, which is why I argue that connection isn't just about social fulfillment, it's protection. And that connection is extremely difficult, particularly for those who are neurospicy. And again, that's where the extra effort comes in, which is a whole lot of fun with that emotional labor piece. But it is about protection and survival. And you need that connection to people who are in the trenches with you. You also need that connection to people outside, because the people outside will keep you grounded and help you realize, like, okay, all right, I am in a different place. The reason why this is hard and feels weird is because it is hard and it is weird. And you need the people in the trenches with you to, because it's sort of like with any social media, we only see the best parts. We only see the curated parts. But when you sit and talk to people about like, oh my God, I'm taking regression. It took me 6 hours to get through this homework. You don't realize, oh, it took everyone else 6 hours. And so when you do that, it really just helps keep you from sinking deeper into that hole of like, wow, I just can't hack it. Um, because you not only see how bizarre academia is, but also how much everyone else is also trying and struggling, even if they're normal.
Um, I have one more closing kind of question to ask you, but I wanted to get to these ones in the chat first because mine can wait. We've kind of talked around it, but um,
Mhm.
so Rachel put in first that her biggest issue is getting empathy from an advisor when unable to work. Any suggestions for how to navigate that?
That is really, really hard. And it goes back. I think I saw another comment on this. It's the people who we need to buy in are the least likely to buy in. And so there is to some degree, you cannot force people to change their minds, which hurts. It really hurts, particularly with if you're stuck with an advisor. If your advisor is remotely open-minded, sometimes providing them with materials, providing them with articles, even if, peer-reviewed qualitative articles, but even, something from Medium or from the New Yorker. There are op-eds that, because they've been published, someone who is in academia would be more likely to listen to. Because if it's just your experience, they're like, oh, but that's just you. And they can, even if they're a lovely empathic person, they will rationalize it by saying, but this is just you. And it's not about a disability. It's about you not trying hard enough. And so if you can pull up those materials, that can sometimes be helpful. But if you have someone who just even won't look at it, that's just hard. And I wish there was a way to change that. But from Rachel, I'm gonna have to check that out. I think there isn't, unfortunately, enough that we can do as students. And that's where I think administration and departments come in, where you have to impose that, no, you have to center student voices, you have to act with intentionality. And if you have questions as a professor, fine, pass it up the chain. You don't get to make an executive decision to push back on someone and say, well, is chronic fatigue really a thing, or are you just not getting enough sleep? And being like, well, my insomnia prevents me from getting sleep. And how do I explain to you that? So there is a limit to, unfortunately, what we can do, but yeah. Yeah, sorry, Rachel. It's a really tough battle.
Mute button. Sorry. So that actually ties really well into what Marjorie had kind of asked in the chat, and some people have responded. Running into the issue of providing templates for online courses, templates for syllabi, workshops, etc., and the issue is that instructors just don't have to use them or attend. And how do you get instructors to change that frame of mind?
I think, and this goes from the top down kind of thing I've been mentioning. There is a limit to what you can require. And as someone who has taught, I would be resentful if someone forced things on me. At the same time, I do think that if we standardize certain tests, if we standardize expectations in academia, which to say that we already do that, then why isn't that we cannot standardize certain practices? So even if it comes down to, at the beginning of every term, the department sends out a reminder of, hey, here's a list of the templates you should be using. And not saying like you have to use them, but the keywords being should be, that kind of reflect well, this isn't maybe a university requirement, but if you want to be a good professor, you should, this is best practice. And I also am so loath to suggest more workshops and more requirements, but the reality is that that's the only way you can get people to do what needs to be done. And so maybe it comes down to integrating these things into teaching workshops, where it's just like, all right, so we're going to be doing teaching, and just these are the templates you should use, and this is why. Just works for everyone.
The department meetings, places where they have to be.
Exactly.
Find them there, and one of the things that I've found really helpful in this regard too is give them an example, if you can, of a thing that doesn't work, and then show them why the one you're suggesting does. And there's still going to be people who are just flat out, I'm not going to do it. But a lot of times, if they just don't understand what the motivation is behind it, be like, look, when I try to use a screen reader on your syllabus, nothing happens.
Yeah,
when I use
this
it
is
on
what it looks
mine,
like. This is my
something
experience.
happens. Like,
Yeah, and I think Amy points out, and part of my interest is in motives behind helping behaviors. And so that's why I talk about, fine, this is why it is in your own best interest to do this. It will ultimately save you time. And that also, that becomes a difficulty for course designers and people in teaching centers to create those materials. But you do sometimes have to appeal to people's self-interest. And there are ways to do that, but we have to be intentional about it.
Are there any other questions for our guest? Give you,
Yep, Amy.
yeah,
It takes some psychological maneuvering, which I realize is not in every department's wheelhouse. It is a lot in mine because I've interacted with children who can't voice their needs. And I've interacted with topics like empathy, and student organizations. But there's a lot to be said for giving people a sense of agency, even if you're imposing something on them, which takes intentionality in art, but is incredibly important because everyone's got a brain and sometimes we have to manipulate them. The brain, I mean, not the people.
understood. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to ask you one thing, and it is, what does a truly accessible academic environment look like to you?
That's a hard one because that means the first step of that, centering students, which also means, hiring consultants who are disabled. And that also goes to hiring consultants who are of other minority populations, which I recognize can add up. You could end up with too many cooks in the kitchen. Um, that being said, I think that would be the first step, um, because every student body will have different needs. Um, I think a truly accessible environment, um, to some degree, has to provide everyone with a sort of checklist, um, because you don't know what you don't know, and that's really across the board. And so the onus is on the university to
Mm,
put stuff on the radar.
yeah.
Um, and so that first piece of awareness, that first piece of providing a framework, um, and to some degree imposing that framework. Uh, it doesn't necessarily have to be a requirement, but pushing the words of this is best practices, and
Mm.
if you want to be a good educator, this is what you have to do, with the implication being if you're not doing these things, you're not a good educator. Um, and there's a piece of accountability, which institutions really don't like. Um, and yes, Marjorie, learning every day. And a lot of times you'll run into people who've been in the field for like 30 years. They're like, I know everything. Um, and who was it, Einstein? Oh God, I feel so dumb for misquoting someone and trying to feel like I'm name dropping. But that a truly wise person knows that they know nothing. Um, and that we all need to adopt a attitude of humble curiosity. And that's as researchers too. I think, you've run into horrible anthropological work of people going into communities and being like, wow, look at these savages. And that's not humble curiosity. That's I know better.
Mm.
So I think if we start with that humble curiosity, with that putting things on people's radars from the top down, those are the first two things. And from there, the practices get carried out. Um, and theoretically, people would be held accountable, but then that goes back to the emotional labor of being put on minority communities and that whole fun, jazz. It's challenging in this society. There's no easy answer, but that would be my starting point.
Having conversations like this one today, like the ones that you might strike up with a colleague, because those do help you. Jose, thank you for commenting and being so open, um, about that. But we all live in our own worlds, and it's very easy to get siloed, and we may think that we're very aware, but we all have, I mean, who hasn't taken the Harvard implicit bias tests and been like, oh, yeah, because we are all
That
humans.
mhm.
We're all humans and we try our best, but it's when we refuse to have that self-awareness or try to make space. And I think that's something that we could do better, in academia is making space for some of the emotional intelligence pieces that we often don't give credit, that help us develop awareness and learn how to center those voices. Because there are a lot of people out there who, if you say that phrase to them, I think would be like, what do you mean by that?
I think I want to respond to Jose's comment actually because
We got time.
yeah, oh good. It's something, unfortunately, it does come on both sides. Because the person who you would want to take this advice might not even be listening to it. Um, when someone comes up to you and mentions your bias or mentions, you're enacting, absolutely, Marjorie. I would be hugely flattered. Uh, I think people who get that feedback tend to get very defensive. And we all, you might have a bad day. We will get defensive, but that at the end of the day, we have to recognize that someone taking the time to give us that feedback is that's energy, that's time. If they didn't care, if they thought you were a lost cause, they wouldn't say anything. So having to reframe someone giving that feedback as like, oh, this is an expression of care. This is an expression of respect that someone wants me to improve. And from the other side, when you do give that feedback, and I'm so sorry to add emotional labor, but having to frame things as that and saying, hey, look, I know this might come across as harsh, or when you get that defensive response, I can absolutely understand why you're defensive. And I'm not trying to say that this is pervasive through the way you act towards other people. I'm saying that in this moment, this behavior has this consequence, and we call this consequence ableist. And this is why. And so, all these things easier said than done, but that aspect of defensiveness does have to be addressed on both sides. And it's a big barrier on multiple levels.
Thank you so very much, Alina, for all of that. And thank you all for being here. There are some links that are just now getting put in the chat. This recording, as I said, will be up early next week on the ASC website. And that link is in there. Also on the ASC YouTube channel. Any resources that Dr. Carpenter shares, we'll make sure to get those out there as well. I want to thank my co-moderator, Sierra Lashbrook, for taking care of the chat there. And just to let you all know, Accessibility Summer Camp 2026 is on the books for June 12th. And next week, we're launching our call for proposals. So if you would like to submit a session, that information will be coming out. It'll be on the website. It'll be all over our social media. And if you want to follow our mailing list, you can link to that on the website. But please, please, please join me in thanking and giving our guest a hand. Thank you for being here, Lina. I have truly enjoyed our conversations leading up to this and today.
Absolutely. I was so glad I was able to share this. And thank you so much for being a lovely audience. I love the comments in the chat.
Oh, right? I love a good feisty, vibrant chat. Like,
I'm a big believer in the chat function. Yeah. No, it's wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I hope we'll see you at the next ASC Live. We don't have one scheduled yet, but I'm working on something for December. So like I said, just keep tuned into the website and the socials. We'll make sure you know what's going on. Lina, hopefully we'll talk to you again at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone.
Happy Friday, all.